الحمد لله أحمده وأستعينه وأستحده وأستغفره وأؤمن بجل وعلا ولا أكفر وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله بالهدى ودين الحق لأظهره على دين كله ولو الكره الكافرون الحمد لله رب العالمين خالق الإنسان مما وتين والصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد أيها المسلمون. The topic that I'm going to be talking about today is the topic of Muslim-non-Muslim relations. And the reason I want to talk about this topic is because these relations have been in a state of crisis on both sides of the equation, both on the sides of Muslims in the attacks on the churches, unfortunately, in Egypt as well as in Iraq, and in the rise, of course, of Islamophobia across the world, and certainly in the United States and in Europe. As recently as January 5th, in the French newspaper Le Monde, there was a survey that was done of French and Germans, and it was found out that over 40% of them see Islam and Muslims as a threat. And as you know, France has the largest population of Muslims in Europe, about 5 million. And so this is, for us, a major concern, because the equivalent of the KKK is rising in the form of EDL in Britain and in the form of Le Pen in France. So the topic of this khutbah really is, how should Muslims interact with non-Muslims? And it is imperative for us then to understand the nature of non-Muslim relations in answering that question. And my khutbah is divided into 3 parts. The first part, I'm going to attempt to refute very briefly the myth of Islam being spread by the sword, which is something that Islamophobes have been trotting out again and again. In the second part second section of this khutbah, if it is a myth that Islam was spread by the sword, then what is the rule in Islam for the general rule for the relations between Muslims and non-Muslims? And then in the third section of this khutbah, I'm going to try to talk about some exceptions to that rule. So let's talk about this myth of Islam being spread by the sword. And I've, in the past, given a khutbah on just this topic, so I'm going to go very quickly here. There are 4 major points that we need to remember here. One is that there's no single verse in the Quran and no hadith to support the spread of Islam through violence, force, or manipulation. And the Quran is very clear, of course, in Surah 2, verse 256, where Allah is saying, "La ikraha fid din, qad tabayyana ar-rushdu min al-ghayy." And so that let there be no compulsion in religion, and truth stands clear from error. So when we look at the basic, the core, the benchmark for us as Muslims is that we cannot force Islam onto others, that people have to choose their faith. And this, in fact, is confirmed in Surah 10, verse 99 to 100, where Allah is saying that the matter of guidance is totally in the hands of God. And I'm quoting in English here, where Allah is saying, "No soul can believe except by the will of Allah." That hidayah is not for us to give. We cannot force somebody to have faith. That, in fact, ultimately, it is in the hands of Allah. The third point, then, is, given the directives from Allah in the Quran, what methods are permissible for the spread of Islam? And in Surah 16, verse 125, Allah is saying, "Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'izati al hasanati wajadilhum billati hiya ahsan." And invite all to the way of your Lord with wisdom and beautiful preaching, and argue with them in ways that are best and most gracious. Right there, what is interesting about the relationship between Islam and Muslims is one, that Allah is encouraging us to invite all. Right there, Islam is not limiting its call to a specific group of people. Islam is not an elitist religion. Islam is opening its arms to the whole of humanity. But the most important words clearly are the ones in ways that are best and most gracious. Not with weapons, not with a gun to somebody's head, not with torture, but in ways that are best and gracious, so they can see the beauty of this deen and decide on their own whether to embrace it or not. And the fourth point is that the concept of jihad is not the same, is not synonymous with the concept of holy war. And if you look at Islamophobes, Steve Emerson, Robert Spencer, Pamela Geller, all of them, they make the same mistake. And they come back again and again to this point. Well, the two things we have to remember. The term holy war and the term infidel were not invented by Muslims, but they were rather invented by the Crusaders themselves. The second point is, as Dr. Jamal Badawi indicates, is that term holy war, if you translate it into Arabic, is harb muqaddasa. And if you go and look in the Quran, you will never find these two words together. As you know, the term jihad comes from the word Arabic jahida, which of course means effort and striving. And as I'm sure previous khatibs have talked about, military ventures are a very small part of jihad. But the interesting part here is that there is a whole etiquette. When Muslims do have to make war, there's the whole etiquette of how to prosecute war. You cannot attack women, you cannot attack children, you cannot attack old people, and so on and so forth. You cannot torture, you cannot mutilate. And that in itself is a topic of another khutbah. And if you look at some Western writers such as James Mish and Deleuze, they have indicated that in no part of history have Muslims used war to try to convert others to Islam. So in the first section of this khutbah then, I've attempted very briefly to repudiate the myth that Islam forced itself on other people by the sword. And the benchmark indeed is that of let there be no compulsion in religion. In the second section of this khutbah, then the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is the general rule in terms of Muslim, non-Muslim relations? Now, if you look in the Quran, in Surah 60, verse 8 and 9, لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم تخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم. Where Allah is saying, Allah does not forbid you with regard to those who fight you not for your faith, nor drive you out of your homes, from dealing kindly and justly with them. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُقْسِطِينَ. For Allah loves those who are just. So as Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi and Dr. Jamal Badawi, both of them indicate in their writings, the general rule of relationships between Muslims and non-Muslims is one of justice, kindness, and peaceful coexistence. And there are two key words in the ayah that I just recited. تَبَرُّهُمْ وَتُقْسِطُوا إِلَيْهِمْ. Tabarruhum, of course, the word bir is part of that. And the word bir refers to kindness, goodness, but most importantly, this is the same word. Remember, Allah is talking about relationships between Muslims and non-Muslims. But this is the same word that Allah uses elsewhere in the Quran to describe the duty that a Muslim has towards his or her parents. So the type of kindness here is special. Okay, وَتُقْسِطُوا إِلَيْهِمْ, of course, basically the idea of justice, no persecution. So that's the general rule governing the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims. Now the second point here is that within this basic rule, Jews and Christians are addressed in a special way. And of course in Surah 5 verse 54, and in many other surahs, Jews and Christians, Ahl al-Kitab, are referred to 25 times in the Quran. And they are closer to Muslims for 5 reasons. One, they believe in God. Of course, we're talking about when they're in their original message. They believe in God. Secondly, they believe in prophethood. Thirdly, they believe in revelations. Fourthly, they believe in a basic moral code of life. And finally, they also believe in the hereafter. So then, what evidence of attitude of tolerance and of peaceful coexistence is there in the Quran? In the Quran, in chapter 5, verse 5, I'm going to only read part of the surah. الْيَوْمَ أُحِلَّ لَكُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتِ وَطَعَامُ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ حِلٌّ لَكُمْ وَطَعَامُكُمْ حِلٌّ لَهُمْ. This day are all things good and pure made lawful unto you. The food of the people of the book is lawful unto you, and yours is lawful unto them. So we can see from the Quran itself, and this is something that you already know, first that the food of the book, of the people of the book, not of polytheists, is allowed to Muslims. Secondly, in the same ayah, the ultimate proof of tolerance, that in marriage, that Muslim men are permitted to marry Christian or Jewish women, but not atheists, and that these spouses, whether Jewish or Christians, are allowed to practice their religion. And also in the Quran, Allah is saying in Surah 29, verse 46, وَلَا تُجَادِلُوا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ إِلَّا بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا مِنْهُمْ. And do not dispute with the people of the book, except with means better than mere disputation, unless it be with those of them who inflict wrong and injury. So to avoid, and we see people, unfortunately, Muslims sometimes, and we see non-Muslims do that,